at Fukushima, we had a triple meltdown. One of those meltdowns in reactor building 3 was different than the others. It was more catastrophic, although reactor 4, the building got severely damaged. The explosion in reactor 3 was different. And the likely reason for that was that reactor 3 was running MOX fuel, mixed oxide, which actually includes plutonium reprocessed from decommissioned weapons. So anyway, it is on the one hand efficient to use that material to generate some energy. On the other hand, it creates a worse meltdown scenario. None of the fuel pools, so these are large elevated pools, none of them cracked in any of these explosions. Terrible things.
And these were, by the way, hydrogen gas explosions, not nuclear fission explosions.
Well, the one in building 3 looks to have been a prompt criticality. There does appear to have been a nuclear detonation, but the explosions that ripped apart the buildings were hydrogen explosions. They were hydrogen explosions, just so that people who are watching get it. The idea is that the radioactivity actually tore apart the water, producing hydrogen and oxygen, so that inside the containment buildings, you had hydrogen building up with oxygen, and then it takes nothing to...
some sort of ignition.
Something ignites it. And this left a terrible, terrible mess, including buildings that even robots couldn't go into and last more than, I don't know, an hour to even survey and do cleanup work. Anyway, so it was a terrible mess, but it was not nearly as bad as it might have been, right? Had one of these fuel pools cracked, these are elevated fuel pools up above these reactors, right? Had one of these fuel pools cracked, and there's no reason other than luck that we didn't get a crack, it would have emptied of water. The fuel rods were so hot that the zirconium cladding would have caught fire, and you would have had this radioactive smoke pouring out of these fuel pools until the fire burned itself out. There wouldn't have even been any way to fight such a fire, right? The radioactivity would have been so intense that there would have been no way for human technology to successfully contain it. It just would have had to go out.
Well, right. I mean, it would have been like Chernobyl.
Well, in Chernobyl, there was a mechanism, and people did die, but it was a small number of people who died, and we were talking about, you know, the reactor core, not an accumulation of a bunch of cores sitting in a pool that would have gone dry. Now, mind you, it didn't even require a crack in a fuel pool. The power had simply remained out, and heroic humans had not been able to restore circulation. The water would have boiled off, and the same thing would have happened. It would have caught fire. So my point to you begins with the reactors we presently have are structured in a way that events that are plausible could result in something that would make one of these sites ungovernable. And I don't regard Chernobyl as ungovernable.
Well, I mean, what does ungovernable mean?
It means that human beings can no longer remain on site to do the heroic work necessary to control the release of the pent-up fuel.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, in other words, I think if the fuel rods in the pool were on fire, I think that the Japanese government would go send people to put the fire out, firefighters. Remember, so let's just remember Chernobyl. Chernobyl, we had an explosion, a fire, and melted fuel exposed to the environment.
And melted fuel in the basement below the reactor. You had fuel rods, raw fuel rods, thrown by the explosion out of the building. So strewn around the environment.
And so so basically after that accident, about 28 firefighters died at the accident, and then let's say another 50 or another about 50 total then a few weeks later. Then you get and then you have over a period of years, maybe 200 of the first responders died. And some of them though died in circumstances which are they drank too much or they were killed in car accidents. We're not totally sure. But like, let's say a couple hundred people died. Then we had an increase in thyroid cancer. About, let's say 4,000, which is a highly treatable cancer. You remove the thyroid gland and you take thyroxine. So nobody wants to get cancer, but a lot of us will get it. And if you had to get cancer,
it's not a bad one.
It's not a bad one. So 4,000 premature deaths over an 80-year period from thyroid cancer. No increase in other cancers, according to the United Nations investigations.
Yes, there's a question about how good those numbers are, how sensitive those measures are. There's also a question. Let's say that Chernobyl, obviously the reactors were very different, and there was a part of the Chernobyl disaster that was very Russian in nature because the way the reactor was structured was more dangerous. On the other hand, what if a Chernobyl-like accident happened at Diablo Canyon? Who fights the fire?
The firefighters.
What if they don't go?
Well, they have to go. It's their job. It's like saying,
what happened in Uvalde?
What happened in 9/11?
Well, we had heroes going into those buildings. But what I'm saying is there's a question. First of all, we know what happened to those buildings.
Yes.
We do not know what happens if Diablo Canyon does what Chernobyl did. We do not know the psychology of people and who has what authority to order whom to fight what fires at what cost to their families. And basically, you know.
Let's go back to just maybe I want to address that. I don't want to skip over, but I want to continue the Chernobyl conversation. So with Chernobyl, we did have significant radioactive release. And I think what I would say, and I suspect you would agree, is that we're not saying that the radiation released didn't cause any cancers. What we're saying is it didn't cause enough cancers to detect an increase over the baseline of cancers that had been occurring before that. In other words, we don't see an increase in cancers, non-thyroid cancers after Chernobyl. To kind of go, so it's not to say that no one did, it just says that a lot of people die, you know, we have a significant percentage of people that get cancer and a significant percentage of people that die from cancer. So if it did have an increase, it was not detectable at the levels at which we're able to monitor cancer mortality.
Right. I would argue that it's a nightmare scenario in the sense that what you're talking about, first of all, people do not intuit the difference between the danger of radiation, which in large measure people are too afraid of, and the danger of radioactive particles, which people are not afraid of enough, in my opinion. That radioactive particles are a particular medical hazard because we do not have evolutionary experience with them, and therefore we do not have mechanisms that protect us, whereas radiation is a fact of living in the universe, and we are pretty well protected against transient radiation exposures below a threshold.
Yeah, though, to be fair, when the people in Fukushima that lived in Fukushima province after the accident and who lived in areas where they had high levels of consumption of radioactive particles in their food and diet, namely the farmers that lived around there, did not have elevated rates of cancer.
According to whom?
British Medical Journal.
Okay. Now, the problem is that I have now watched the British Medical Journal engaged in COVID shenanigans. I've watched the Japanese government engaged in all kinds of post-Fukushima shenanigans, like adding non-radioactive material to radioactive waste to bring it below a threshold that made it legal to burn, transporting radioactive material around Japan to mask the signal of the difference between the exposed population and the unexposed population. So the point is, look, I would love to say, let's just look at the evidence and see how dangerous these things actually were. But at some level, one gets the idea that lots of people are not really interested in the evidence being reviewed in an objective way. And when they have control over what access we get to the evidence, I become agnostic about how good that evidence actually is.
Okay, well, so one of the characters in Apocalypse Never, who I have tell the story of the evidence, is Jerry Thomas. She's a professor at Imperial College London. Her mother died of leukemia. She's been very concerned about cancer. She ran the Chernobyl Tissue Bank, which is a bank of all the tissues of the thyroid glands. Goes back and forth to, dealt with victims of Chernobyl, deeply sympathetic person, never been on the payroll of the nuclear industry, independent scholar. And I'll have her walk the reader through the evidence. And the picture is basically, it's not like that there's no risk. It's just that these risks are outweighed by other risks in people's in other people's lifestyles.
You and I, well, not only in other people's lifestyles, but the problem is we have a human bias issue.
Yes.
Right? If you have, 19 kids and 2 teachers gunned down at school, it captivates the imagination and we become focused on it. If policy about the quality of the food that children are eating kills, 20 times that number every year,
right,
we don't notice it.
Right.
Right. And so there's no question that wrapped up in the nuclear issue, the nuclear power issue, is the question of the relative costs and benefits, and that it's hard to look away from 4,000, deaths from thyroid cancer, because we can say, hey, those are probable cancers, those people died from something that was spit out of this one building, right? We get that. We don't get that the way we generate, coal is dirty.
Right.
Right. It puts particles in the air. People breathe those particles. They have respiratory issues, so, a proper analysis would look downstream of all of these technologies, and it would be dispassionate about, certain number of people are going to die as a result of nuclear accidents. That's unfortunate, but we have to compare it to the number of people who would die from other consequences of
air pollution
technology.
is the usual comparison.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm not in any way discounting that a proper analysis might look at a shocking number of nuclear deaths and say, yes, but in comparison to the technology we didn't deploy, it's actually fewer. Here's the problem. What do we do with the fuel? The spent fuel?
Okay, I think it's best where it is, at the site of electricity production. I see no reason to move it. I think we will, in the next century, reuse that fuel in new reactors that are fast reactors that reuse the fuel. But where it is now, it's the best place for it. There's no need to transport it. We can just keep it on site.
Yeah, it's
fine where it is.
Stepped into my trap.
Okay.
I mean, there was no way out of my trap, but you stepped into it. Okay, so it's the best place for it.
Yes.
It's a terrible place for it.
Okay.
It's not saying it's not best.
Okay.
Here's the thing. Because we've never figured out what to do with that spent fuel and it just keeps accumulating.
In the dry cask storage.
In any version. Look, the fuel pools.
I agree that the pools are the most sensitive place for it.
That's the most likely place for us to lose control of one of these sites, which has not happened yet.
It happened in Chernobyl.
It didn't happen in Chernobyl. The fires were fought. A number of people died fighting fires, doing heroic things. I'm talking about something that would prevent a site from being manageable, where you would just have to let it unfold.
But why would anybody do that?
Because
would firefighters be like, we're not going to go do our job and put that fire out?
Well, first of all, I don't know anything about the psychology of firefighters who are downstream of the awareness of what happened to the firefighters who fought at Chernobyl. It's possible that in the context of certain cultures, that it is possible to simply order people to go to their deaths fighting nuclear fires and the like. It is possible to reward people's families enough that somebody would rationally do so. But it doesn't mean that I think if Diablo Canyon was to be in a serious crisis, that we necessarily know what would happen. And effectively, what we have to know is that at every single one of the 400 civilian nuclear reactors operating on planet Earth today, that the proper structures are in place to get somebody to fight that fire, even if it is at the cost of their life. Then there's a question about, do we reach levels of radiation so high that actually it is implausible that you could fight, that the fire is too big and the level of radiation is so high that you actually can't get anybody to do the work because it is too devastating too early.
Okay, but so let's deal with the first issue. We have fire. So how many firefighters do we think died in 9/11? Was it hundreds, right?
I believe so. I'm not.
So I mean, we have firefighters that sign up for a job that is by its nature dangerous. that they rush into buildings that are at risk of collapse. They are surrounded by stories of people dying. We have militaries, which are formed of young men that, contrary to their instinct for self-preservation, die. Often fighting to protect, Afghan girls
and
Iraqi people that they've never met before.
Right, but there's a difference between entering a scenario in which you feel you have a pretty good chance of surviving and a hopeless scenario, which is what happened at Chernobyl, right? People walked into a hopeless scenario and did the work.
Yeah.
Right, and thank goodness that they did. The question is, can we rely on that 100% of the time? Wow, nothing I know about humans tells me that you could rely on that 100% of the time.
But then what would be the specific? So in other words, okay, but so we could imagine that at a chemical refinery, right?
Yep.
So what makes nuclear different? I mean, in other words, why would they be less likely to?
Well, I'm not certain I know enough about what chemistry we're doing in chemical plants, but my sense is chemical plants, we have conceivable protective gear for virtually any scenario that would unfold.
Yeah.
So it would be possible to manage your way through it. But radiation is a different animal altogether. In other words, the fact that you can be exposed to such huge amounts of radiation that you effectively fail on the spot is a hazard.
Well, it's actually, I mean, I don't think that there's I mean, it's a hot fire, right? So the acute radiation sickness is not happening faster than the fire. Let's say you have a fire in one of the pools.
Yep.
You send in a bunch of firefighters and you're like, look, guys, this
send
is a bad
them in
one.
In what way?
Well, I mean, they're going to be there on the same way you send them into any fire.
Well,
right?
But are they shooting water out of hoses into a pool that's cracked?
I don't think. No, it'd probably not be water.
Okay.
Probably some other fire retardant.
Do we have that fire retardant that you could pour into a cracked pool that actually shuts down that fire?
I mean, it wouldn't be water, right? It would be some sort of fire retardant to put out
some sort of
same thing they did with Chernobyl, right? Where they're spraying material to put out the fire and to cover up the radioactive materials.
I don't think Chernobyl's issue was a fire. I think
it was a fire.
There was certainly fire,
yeah.
But that wasn't the primary issue. Basically, getting the material back into the core and then covering it so that it was not emitting.
Well, they put out the fire, and then the days that followed, they had these guys called liquidators that would go in for very brief periods of time,
shovel the stuff off the roof.
shovel stuff, and they'd like have a stopwatch, and they would go in and. It is what it is.
No, because a fuel pool fire is a different animal, right? If you had that material on fire from its own internal heat, I don't think there's anything that you could do, or if there is, I want to know what that plan is now. I don't want to find out about it after some fuel pool has cracked and dried.
But do you doubt that there is a plan? I mean...
I doubt that there's a good plan.
I would suspect the plan's better now than it's ever been, given the fears around Fukushima. Okay.
I am entitled to know it as a person living on this planet with these reactors.
But I mean, I would suspect that it's basically a plan to get material onto the burning.
Right. I want to know what that material is. I want to know what the mechanism of delivery is and how tolerant it is to the chaos of a one-off accident.
Yeah.
Right. Something like happened at Fukushima, right? Where we got very lucky, right? You had multiple meltdowns, right? You had the aftermath of a massive earthquake, right?
Yes.
All sorts of challenges there.
A tsunami that killed 15,000 people instantly.
Right.
Didn't contribute to deaths, but killed 15,000 people instantly.
Right. Killed them instantly. Right.
Right.
And, swamped the generators and all. But I want to know what those plans are. I want to know what the material is. I want to know, are you delivering it by helicopter? If not by helicopter, by what other means? What kind of energy does it require? How effective is it? How tolerant is it to the different ways that a pool could fail? How tolerant is it to the number of hours after the pool has failed that you get there? In other words, how much fire has occurred? How much further damage to the pool? How much melting? All of these things are highly relevant to whether you can get anything to stick to these elevated pools to shut down that fire. Because my contention is That what we've got currently is a system in which we mine uranium, we enrich it, we then put it through a reactor and we make materials that are as toxic as anything on Earth. And then we don't have a plan for long-term storage, which means...
Well, no, but we just agree that we do have a plan for the long-term storage. We're talking about the pools.
No, we don't have a plan.
I mean, the dry cask storage isn't going to... Those fuel rods in dry cask storage are not going to catch on fire.
No, they're not going to catch on fire. But how long do they remain contained?
Well, why is that even a concern?
Because ultimately, I believe, if you don't have a plan for long-term storage, and I don't think Yucca Mountain is a plan. Obviously, it didn't unfold that way. But if you don't have a plan for long-term storage, every bit of this stuff that you produce is ultimately going to find its way into the environment. And that's my concern.